This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the course of the hour, we'll run through the business news stories you need to know about from the continent and beyond. But first, a quick run through the markets. Let's start in Ghana. The composite index over there has had a relatively slow start to 2022, with 3.5% decline over 11 days. Today was really no different, the index falling by around 0.41 points. Centum shares in East Africa closed about 2.1% higher after the real estate unit over there announced it had secured a $150 million share subscription facility from Luxembourg-based GEM Global Yield. Kenya was also, of course, hit by a countrywide power outage. Towers on one of its key transmission lines running from the 168 megawatt Kiambere Dam to Embakasi in the capital collapsed. Normal supply had been restored in the country about 5 hours later, but not everywhere. And finally, of course, the agricultural firm Sassini also produced its full-year results today, 27% rise in revenue to about $47 million. Here's what's coming up tonight. Kenya suspends inbound and transit flights from the United Arab Emirates for 7 days. Tourist arrivals in Tanzania rise despite global travel woes. And the incoming German central bank chief disputes the ECB's inflation outlook. Our starting point at this hour, though, is in Tunisia. The authorities over there have set the threshold for the automatic adjustment of fuel prices at 3% instead of 5% throughout 2022. And authorities say the measures are aimed at reducing pressure on the energy budget and to better control the energy deficit that has continued to grow. From Tunis, here's CGTN's Adin Chouachi with the details.
The Director General of Hydrocarbons at Tunisia's Energy Ministry explained that the government has been spending heavily on fuel subsidies and had put in place policies to mitigate the energy deficit. Tunisia's revision of fuel prices will affect the prices of gasoline, unleaded gasoline and diesel, but not those of domestic gas cylinders.
Tunisia subsidizes fuel and energy in general. However, this strategy negatively affects the state public finances. The objective of the automatic fuel price adjustment is to adjust the price in accordance with the international market. When a barrel price goes up by $1, it costs an additional $45 million to the state budget.
Authorities say that the gradual lifting of subsidies on energy products will allow Tunisia to reach real prices by 2026.
The gradual lifting of subsidies on energy products is part of a structural reform program for the energy sector. It is one of the main topics of negotiations with the International Monetary Fund.
The 2022 state budget has provided zero taxation for all electric vehicles, including cars and buses.
Tunisia has made a giant leap by encouraging renewable energy production. The state is eyeing 30% renewable energy target by 2030. Now the authorities are encouraging the import and production of electric vehicles. This decision will have a positive impact on the economy.
The Tunisian Finance Department announced that hybrid vehicles will be subject to a reduced consumption duty of 50%. Motor vehicles carrying more than 10 people, as well as vehicles for the transport of goods, will also be exempted from 30% customs duty. Energy experts assert that investing in renewable energy and using electric cars would promote industrial development in Tunisia. The country's oil and gas production covers less than 40% of its needs, with the difference covered by imports. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
All right, then let's dive into the world of aviation. The Kenyan Civil Aviation Authority has suspended all inbound and transit passenger flights from the United Arab Emirates for 7 days. That suspension took effect on the 10th of January, but it does not affect cargo flights. It does come barely a few days after the UAE extended its flight ban on Kenya due to alleged fake COVID-19 vaccination certificates. Now, the Dubai aviation regulator pointed out that travelers were testing positive for COVID after arrival, despite carrying negative test results when they boarded. It's believed that the scheme in question involved a racket of private medical testing centres. Kenya's Health Ministry says it has launched a probe into the matter. Let's explore this in a bit more detail. Jim Stenman joins us now from Dubai with more on this story. So, Jim, Dubai authorities have essentially refused to take on passengers from 18 African countries. Kenya is just one of those. But is this primarily due to a row over COVID testing protocols, or is there something else at play here?
Well, I think it's worth stressing that Emirates has no official comment on this. I did reach out to them earlier today, but it is feasible. It's a combination of testing regimes and also this global rise in Omicron cases that we've seen. Dubai, for its part, it's been really praised for its handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. It recently ranked #1 in Bloomberg's Global Resilience ranking, and it's halfway through hosting the World Expo. So it is studying numbers globally very, very closely. And here in the UAE, 2,500 cases were discovered in just the last 24 hours. Now that is up from less than 100 cases in early December. So again, it is feasible that authorities here are studying the numbers. They're seeing an increase and they're just being extra vigilant. I did also speak to a couple of travel experts here that sort of reiterated that there seems to be some concerns about testing regime at this period in time.
Okay, so what is the logic, though, for barring incoming traffic? So we're saying, okay, if you're a passenger from any of these 18 countries, you're not going to come into Dubai, but we're still going to keep outbound flights to some of these destinations running. I mean, that doesn't sound like it's helping them to actually keep COVID under control.
Okay, so that's an interesting question. It's essentially, one could speculate, a combination of allowing foreign citizens who are currently in the UAE or flying via the UAE to return to their countries. But at the same time, the UAE is interested in repatriating its own people and close relatives to Emiratis and diplomatic missions. Some of those flights might also be able to use as cargo flights going back to the UAE. So it sort of works both ways there.
All right, we'll leave it there for the time being. Jim Stenman in Dubai. Thank you very much. Now, since the start of the coronavirus pandemic, a slew of cyber attacks have dominated the headlines. Amid a rising demand for online services across Africa, the continent has become particularly vulnerable to cybercrime. From Johannesburg, here's CGTN's Angela Coppola exploring how these rise in cyber threats are not set to just hamper the economic recovery from the pandemic, but they might also cause long-lasting damage.
A continent-wide cybersecurity concern is the increasing number of ransomware or cyber extortion attacks.
Only 30% of the public services organization that participated said they are prepared for this threat. And I guess the key takeaway, what I found is that 5% of the participants that we surveyed said they would pay out in case they were attacked. 4% said they did pay out.
Cyber attacks come in many forms, and businesses and countries react and cope differently. But when it comes to advanced persistent threat attacks, they are generally state-sponsored and go largely undetected, sometimes for years. Everyone is equally exposed.
I would say that no one is prepared for advanced persistent threat attacks, no one, because they would use our zero-day exploits and there wouldn't be a 100% protection for such kind of threats. But on average, South Africa does good compared to some regions on the world regarding cyber criminal mass-scale attacks.
Looking ahead to 2022, and IT security managers are worried about the actions of the US authorities as they go after the ransomware gangs, driving them to other continents.
We will see more attacks, particularly against critical infrastructure. And something that has been forecasted on a global scale is that the ransom demands will become higher. These guys have money to spend. They will buy what's called zero-day vulnerabilities to make their attacks more efficient. And it's just a much bigger threat than it's already been this year.
Ganeva says that advanced persistent threat attacks are an increasing reality on the continent.
APT actors that were not present here before would enter the region for their particular reasons, driven by the relations between different countries, the economic situation, the investments in the African continent. and we probably will face more APT actors present in the African continent.
Cybersecurity and cyber threats are increasing on the African continent as the continent opens up to include more businesses. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
All right, and a quick run through some company news. Let's start in the world of real estate. Centum Real Estate in Kenya has signed an agreement with Luxembourg-based private equity firm GM Global Yield for a 36-month, $150 million share subscription facility following a public listing. Now, that facility will allow the firm to draw the funds by issuing shares of common stock to GEM. It will also control the timing and the maximum size of such drawdowns, and there's no minimum drawdown obligation. Still in East Africa, Sasini PLC is one of Kenya's major tea and coffee producers. It's posted a net profit and non-controlling interest, attributable to non-controlling interest rather, of around $5 million for the fiscal year ending in September 2021. Sasini has attributed the performance to better prices in some commodities, the depreciation of the Kenyan shilling, good weather conditions for growing, and that of course resulted in much higher coffee volumes and cost containment measures within the group. Sales of new vehicles in South Africa were 22% higher last year than in pandemic hit 2020. Demand for new vehicles, however, was still well below the levels that we saw in 2019. New vehicle sales fell during December 2021 by 3.5% compared to the same month in 2020. But while other vehicle categories declined, sales of passenger cars did go up by at least 1.7%. And finally, IKEA has cut sick pay for unvaccinated UK staff told to self-isolate after close contact with someone who was infected with COVID-19. Workers at the Swedish furniture giant could now receive as little as $130 a week. That's the statutory sick pay minimum while they isolate. The company admitted vaccination status is a very emotive topic, but it said its policy will need to be updated with the changing circumstances. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up. Tourist arrivals in Tanzania rise despite global travel woes. And the International Monetary Fund warns emerging economies of tough times ahead as US monetary policy starts to tighten.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
So this is it. I'm just about to be shot.
Tents here, bottles are being thrown. As they do so,
there are about 3 critical bridges here in Malawi. That's one of them. We're going to cross that bridge.
As you can see behind me, police forces
who are replying with gas. Gas just came in.
Tear gas, so it's all begun now.
Divisions leading the charge into West Mosul have brought us here.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots.
This is where most of the fighting has been concentrated.
This is the front line now after 9 days of fighting.
We're about 2 to 3 kilometers from
within
the front
clear
line.
view of this front line position.
There's more to this place than just glorious landscapes. There's more to it than just, say, Table Mountain or glorious, endless salt flats. There's more to it than countries that are home to some of the deepest mines in the world. There is so much more to this place, even if it is home to some of the finest diamonds on the planet. It is the sheer diversity of the people who call Southern Africa home and the relentless drive to make it a better place that make it so special. And we know that because this too is home. No one knows Southern Africa like we do. CGTN, see the difference. Welcome back to the program. Tanzania's head of state, Samia Suluhu Hassan, says that 1.4 million tourists visited the country last year despite the COVID-19 pandemic, which severely affected its tourism sector. Now, the government's expectations are that the tourism sector will continue to flourish this year and beyond. Here's Daniel Kijo with the numbers.
Dennis Glibik has dedicated his life to the hospitality industry. Having worked in more than 10 countries and traveling to over 100, he says working in Tanzania may be his best posting yet. Despite the last 2 years being challenging due to the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, he says 2021 saw the beginning of tourists flocking back into the country, scrambling to get away from cold winters for sunny beaches and beautiful savannas.
In Tanzania, you can go to the parks. You have the Serengeti, the Selous. You can visit Mount Kilimanjaro. You can go to Zanzibar. You can do the beaches. You can do culture. You can do heritage. You can do agriculture visits. You can go to Arusha. You know, the variety that this country has to offer is incredible.
When COVID-19 was at its peak, most of Tanzania's primary tourist markets went into lockdowns. In order to save the tourism sector, the Tanzanian government increased promotion and marketing in new emerging markets like Russia, Israel, Burundi, Malawi, Poland, Rwanda, Congo, and France. This move saw tourism arrival numbers increase.
Na kuingiza nchini watalii milioni 1.4.
We received into the country 1.4 million tourists as compared to the 620,867 tourists who visited the country in 2020.
According to the National Bureau of Statistics, Tanzania has one of the world's highest percentages of reserved land as protected areas, about 38%. It has 22 national parks and is home to a large variety of wildlife, including the large animals known as the Big Five. The tourism sector contributes about 17.5% of the country's GDP. To try and keep exposing Tanzania's tourism across the world, President Samia Suluhu Hassan was featured in the Royal Tour documentary. It's a film that portrays key and leading tourist sites. The publicity from the Royal Tour filming and the Tourism Board's marketing efforts, earnings from the tourism sector improved significantly last year.
So the experience that we have gained, we're going to be using on every future potential threat towards our businesses, towards our industry, to how to deal with it.
The government has pledged to remain vigilant in improving the tourism sector despite the challenges posed by COVID-19. It believes this positive trend will bring some relief to the over 1 million people who depend on this industry to survive. Daniel Kijo, CGTN, Dar es Salaam.
Moving on to the global economic picture, even as we're seeing a surge in COVID-19 cases, the International Monetary Fund is warning emerging economies that they must brace for possible rough times ahead, as tighter monetary policies enacted by the US Federal Reserve could essentially trigger capital outflows and currency depreciation. Now, the IMF is arguing that emerging economies must, quote, tailor their response based on the circumstances and the vulnerabilities, end of quote. Central banks which are raising rates to fight inflation should also help people better understand why price stability is so important. Now, the IMF is due to release fresh global economic forecasts on the 25th of January. Let's explore this trend in a bit more detail. And Zetawere is a senior economist at FSD Kenya. It's a trust that focuses on expanding financial inclusion in the country. Thank you for your time as always, Nzete. So let's start with, I guess, the why should we care question. If an SME owner in Joburg or Accra is watching us today, why should they care about why or how quickly Jerome Powell raises rates in the US?
I mean, it's important because it does inform the level, scale, and appetite of financing, particularly for African governments, particularly in sovereign bond market. So if you look at the global financial crisis and how it bottomed out interest rates, what that did is that it really triggered yield hunters, and it sort of enhanced the level of appetite and interest people had for particularly African government sovereign bonds. So when the reverse happens and you start seeing interest rates increasing in areas such as the US, sort of signaling a certain level of stability starting to return to the market. What that tends to mean, particularly at the macroeconomic level, is that the scrutiny that African sovereign governments particularly get is tightened, and then obviously the premiums that are charged are much higher. The reason why that's particularly a concern now is because African governments already pay premiums for the Eurobonds that were floated during this period of COVID. The premiums for countries such as Ghana were extremely high. So the concern is that the combination of a pandemic, which has already enhanced Africa's risk profile, in combination with these raising of the rates in the US, will just mean that any appetite that is sourced from international markets, particularly for African governments, will be very expensive and frankly quite difficult to get sometimes.
But hasn't the market already sort of started to price that in? Because if you look at the yield curves for like Kenyan Eurobonds, 2024, the 2028, the 2032 notes, you see this big jump, especially towards the fourth quarter of 2021. So has the market already priced that in, or is there more pain to come?
Yeah, so that was the point I was making, is that the combination of the pandemic and now this is the problem. Because you have to understand that the fundamental reason why this is happening is that there's been a divergence in the way economies have been responding and recovering from COVID. We still see African economies struggling with the recovery side. That's a very complicated story. And on the other hand, you've got more sort of richer economies that have sort of started to get back on their feet. So on one hand, you're seeing countries like the US starting to signal that we're trying to get things to go back to normal, whereas frankly, in continents such as Africa, things are not normal, and governments have this deep need for credit because their private sector is sort of tanked, their revenue generation capabilities simply do not exist. And a key element of fiscal survival now is being able to credibly raise money in international markets at reasonable rates. And we're already seeing that wasn't happening. So this is already exacerbating a trend that we saw in the pandemic anyway.
Okay, so for economies on the continent, isn't the other main concern here inflation? Because last year we saw Brent crude going up at least 50%. The FAO pointed out earlier this week that their food price index has gone up to levels that they haven't seen in at least a decade. And these, unfortunately, is a situation that central banks really can't respond to.
Yeah, I mean, inflation has multiple drivers. You've got the international factors that you're talking about, but you've also got domestic factors. A key factor of inflation for many countries is the value of the currency, and especially in import economies, of which Africa are many. Many countries are import economies, particularly in terms of consumer goods and manufactured goods. The problem is that the depreciation of their currencies means that the cost of those imported goods are going up. So inflation now has multiple sources of pressure, both internally in the African continent and African countries, as well as the external factors that you mentioned. I think, frankly, the other thing that's really quite important that's linked to inflation is the cost of living question. I think this is something that we've seen complaints across the continent around the cost of living in the context of the pandemic, which you've already alluded to, and linked to the cost of living are the poverty rates. Because if you're looking at an African consumer, on one hand, you've had your income decimated by COVID and sort of the sluggish business and consumer purchasing power. On the other hand, you're seeing this increased cost of living, and then juxtaposed on that, you've got these macroeconomic issues such as inflation and depreciating currencies. So we're really seeing a confluence of factors that is making a larger swath and a larger cadre of Africans a lot more economically vulnerable. And the real crux of the matter that makes me quite concerned is that a lot of African governments simply do not have the fiscal muscle to step into the level of social security support that, frankly, a lot of Africans need right now.
Indeed, and of course 30 million Africans pushed deeper into extreme poverty last year, according to data from the IMF. One last question for you. So in the case of economies that have a lot more exposure in terms of capital flows, how would these capital exits take place? Would it be, a capital fight through the stock market where investors from the West say, look, I'm just going to sell down my portfolio of assets in South Africa, Nigeria and Kenya and call it a day?
I mean, I think it depends definitely on the financial sector and the banking sector in the countries. There are some countries that, for example, in Kenya, the NSE is the main way through which that happens. But you look at our banking sector, particularly if you look at even the subscription in the domestic market to government bonds, it's very much a domestic story. I think the real problem that we're going to be seeing there is we'll see whether investments that would have been made will not happen. So outflow is one way of looking at it, but also a reduction in investment is another way through which we can look. And of course, people are talking about the boom in the tech sector for Africa in 2020. But I think we need to look at the macroeconomic picture and look at the figures that UNCTAD was releasing around the investment, particularly to private sector, sectoral level and firm level. I think is where that's a lot of that is going to be hit. And the combination of the increasing yields in the US, I think it's just going to be tough times for a lot of African firms and certain sectors that don't really have a lot of hype around them right now.
Indeed. We'll leave it there for the time being. And that's from FST. Asante sana, as always. Now, on to Uganda. Economic experts over there urging the government to give a lot more incentives for SMEs so that they can recover from the damage inflicted by the pandemic. Now, besides the stimulus measures introduced by the government, economists also want the state to provide tax relief to some businesses that have been hit particularly hard. Here's CGTN's Hilary Ayesiga with this report.
A rush hour in downtown Kampala, signs of an economy getting back on its feet. But economists say more support from the government is needed if businesses are to fully recover from the effects of COVID-19.
Government should continue offering tax relief to businesses that it thinks may need it, especially now. And I'm talking here about SMEs mainly, to ensure that they are able to get back to a position where they can genuinely contribute to the growth of the economy.
The government has just lifted restrictions on all sectors of the economy. Small and medium enterprises are now hoping to equally tap into job opportunities available, including the public sector.
We've seen increasingly that there are new obstacles being erected. If you look at the printing sector, for instance, government has said that all printing work should only go to 2 government-owned entities. This is not good for the printing sector. The same with construction. Most of the government work is now directed towards the UPDF.
The experts are optimistic that if businesses are given more incentives, the economic growth rate could hit 5% up from 3.5% last year.
Take advantage of this. Those of you who are struggling, the small businesses, begin to prepare yourself to go to any of your bank, your commercial bank with whom you have been dealing with, so that you can take this money to help you to revive your business.
The Uganda government recently announced a recovery fund of about $56 million for small businesses to borrow at less than 10% per annum.
For those businesses that have closed, it's important that a special arrangement is put in place for these businesses to recover. Some may definitely go into insolvency, but the best thing is that all these businesses are supported in some way to get back on their feet.
While this is being appreciated by business owners, economists also want the government to support businesses that have collapsed. But that could be for the short term. In the long run, the government believes mass vaccination against COVID-19 will create an enabling environment for businesses to thrive. Apart from government support, economists are also encouraging business owners to take advantage of the digital technologies available to widen their markets so that they can keep their businesses afloat during this period of the pandemic. Hilary Ayesiga, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
Now, the UN envoy to Mali is due to present a report to the UN Security Council on the situation in the West African state. Leaders from ECOWAS agreed to sanction Mali on Sunday over delayed elections. That decision was later backed by the former colonial power France at the UN Security Council. Mali's interim authorities have condemned these tough measures. They include border closures, a trade embargo, and the cutting off of financial aid to the country. The authorities have called for nationwide demonstrations on Friday against these restrictive measures.
It is regrettable that the efforts of the transitional government were ignored. Fellow countrymen, it's time for all Malians to unite to express and affirm our principles and defend our nation. Every Malian, wherever he or she is, has to act as a defender of the superior interest of Mali. Given the severity of the situation, it's everyone's responsibility to shut all divisions, to assemble around what's more important, which is Mali, our nation. I call for constant mobilization and resilience in the face of the situation. I have to say that even if we regret the illegal and inhuman nature of some decisions, Mali remains open to dialogue with ECOWAS in order to find a consensus between the interest of the Malian people and the respect of the organization's fundamental principles. Our commitment to a return to a normal, secure and peaceful constitutional order has never failed. We once more call on ECOWAS to thoroughly analyze our country's situation while putting the interest of the Malian people above all considerations.
You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. The incoming German central bank chief disputes the ECB's inflation outlook. And demand for cryptocurrencies is surging in Venezuela as the economic crisis over there deepens.
Change is on the horizon. Through the shifting of time, Africa's emerging tech landscape is creating new channels.
There's a hunger for local African content globally.
Shaped by innovation, carved out by a new generation of digital entrepreneurs, sculpted by a mobile revolution, and trickling down to the most remote corners of the continent. TechSpot is seeking out the new concepts in technology, disrupting Africa's traditional sectors.
No one again, he can hold in guns.
Machine guns from police forces toward the protesters.
Were you worried about your life at that particular time?
Not at all.
The activity continues for your time now. What is your assessment of the state of the continent today?
Africa has the potential to power itself.
Excuse me.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Accra is my kind of city. That's because when I'm here, I feel like I'm back home in Lagos or Abidjan, which are two of the major cities I grew up in.
Business in Africa is high risk.
After about a decade covering business news on the continent, I've learned it's all about the high risk, but also the high returns and the high energy. You simply have to adjust in order to keep pace. When I started out as a journalist, my dream was to open people's minds to the different perspectives. From the CEO in the boardroom to the trader out in the street, we all have different stories. From Accra to Addis Ababa, from Cairo to Cape Town, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Here at CGTN, we realize that Africa is on the move, and it's moving fast, but we're moving right along with it. I'm Ucheo Koronkwo, and I'm a business anchor and reporter at CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. Let's run through some of the stories making your headlines at this hour. Starting in Ethiopia, local authorities over there say that a drone strike has killed 17 civilians in the northern region of Tigray. The civilians were reportedly killed in the town of Maisebri. Now, that allegation was made in a report by the zonal administration. Aid workers have also been cited by AFP as basing their report on witness accounts. The strike allegedly took place on Monday, the same day when the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was on a phone call with the US President Joe Biden. The UN envoy to Mali is due to present a report to the UN Security Council on the situation in the country. Leaders from the regional grouping, ECOWAS, agreed to sanction Mali over the weekend due to delayed elections. The decision was later backed by the former colonial power France at the UN Security Council. Mali's interim government has condemned these tough measures. The authorities have in fact called for nationwide demonstrations on Friday against these stringent sanctions. The Transitional Sovereignty Council in Sudan has held its periodic meeting at the Republican Palace. In that gathering, Lieutenant General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan welcomed the initiative put forward by the United Nations to facilitate a dialogue between Sudanese partners. He also called for the involvement of the AU to support that initiative. Members of the Sovereignty Council have formally accepted Abdallah Hamdok's resignation as Sudan's Prime Minister. And finally, the 16-member Southern African Development Community has started its 2 days of deliberations in Lilongwe in Malawi to review the progress of the regional bloc's mission in Mozambique. The troops from member countries have been deployed there since September to support Mozambique combat terrorism and acts of violent extremism in the country's northern province of Cabo Delgado. That's a run through your headlines. Now, back into the world of monetary policy. The new Bundesbank president, Joachim Nagel, has warned in his first speech on the job that inflation in the Eurozone may remain elevated for longer than currently expected. He's urged his colleagues at the European Central Bank to be a lot more vigilant. Now, inflation across the 19-country Eurozone rose by a record 5% last month. The ECB, however, has downplayed that surge. It's blaming energy costs and insisting that inflation will settle back below its 2% target by the end of the year, even without policy tightening. Nagel, however, has challenged that narrative. He says that the recent rise in inflation is not just temporary, and is warning that price growth could continue to come in a lot higher than expected.
It's true that high inflation rates can be attributed to special effects that expire automatically, but not entirely. While prices could rise less than expected in the forecast, I see a danger that inflation could remain high for longer than currently expected.
And people can trust that our commitment to price stability is unwavering, which is critical for the firm anchoring of inflation expectations and for confidence in the currency. And that is indeed especially important today in light of the phase of higher inflation that we are seeing. We understand that rising prices are a concern for all people. And we take that concern not lightly, we take it very seriously.
Now, cryptocurrencies as a means of payment are gaining ground in Latin America. But one country really stands out in that sphere. Venezuela's economic crisis has pushed many of its citizens to turn to crypto in order to preserve what little value they still have left in any currency. Mary Tunimene reports from Caracas.
At Richard Romero's grocery store, all kinds of payments are welcome. Bolivars, dollars, and even crypto coins. Over the last 2 years, he's been using Reserve, an online platform that allows him to exchange and save cryptocurrencies that can then be converted into dollars. It's the way he found to protect his daily sales from losing value.
It allows me to trade with different currencies and with many local banks, and many people here in the town where I work are using the app, so I can give them change if necessary, and most importantly, to secure my income in a platform that helps me to save my money in dollars.
Even street vendors like 58-year-old Rosaura Mejia are beginning to accept digital payments using cryptocurrencies for candies or cigarettes. Rosaura says she has adapted to the new technology in order to survive.
It's a solution because if the customers do not have the dollars in hand, We open my user code, and he can do the purchase, and that ends up in my account.
Struck by hyperinflation and targeted by U.S. sanctions, Venezuela is facing a de facto dollarization. The U.S. dollar is widely accepted, but not everyone has a bank account abroad. That is why platforms with blockchain technology are functioning like a virtual exchange house used by many.
The trend is rapidly growing. According to Chainalysis, a blockchain analytics firm, in 2020, Venezuela ranked third in the world for crypto adoption, only surpassed by Ukraine and Russia.
And with more than 5 million Venezuelans living abroad, remittances are one of the main reasons for the exponential growth. Cryptocurrencies have become a financial lifeline and an easy and practical method for their relatives to send money back home.
If somebody is in Colombia and wants to send money to his family, if they have an account in Colombia and his family have one in Venezuela, you can do it right away without having to go to the bank or look for a third party who's able to send money.
And for those who remain in the country, peer-to-peer sites for trading tokens are helping Venezuelans to charge for their services, like Samuel, a fitness and nutritional trainer. Some of his clients live abroad and pay him using Binance, one of the most popular cryptocurrencies exchange companies in the country.
No matter how far people are, I can do my job and the payment arrives immediately. It's having an independent source of income.
Digital payments are alleviating the country's economic crisis, but most cities lack the proper online infrastructure. Despite all odds, Venezuela is becoming a cashless economy, and crypto coins have a large part to do with it. Maritrini Mena, CGTN, Caracas.
Some of the largest companies in the United States are facing fines starting on Monday, January 10th, if they do not enforce a COVID-19 vaccination and testing mandate. Now, the government will start penalizing firms with more than 100 employees if their staff are not fully vaccinated, or if they're unvaccinated, they have to conduct regular tests. But as Owen Fairclough now reports, some employers are waiting for a critical ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court.
We can't comply. The message from the United States Postal Service pleading with the White House for a reprieve from a COVID-19 vaccine mandate now being enforced. From Monday, companies with more than 100 employees can be fined more than $136,000 for repeatedly violating a law demanding their workers be fully vaccinated for COVID or are tested regularly.
The mandate affects some 80 million employees here in the United States, and the Postal Service, with 650,000 workers, has asked the Biden administration for a 3-month reprieve from the mandate, insisting it needs more time to meet the requirements.
The mandate has divided a country highly polarized by the pandemic even more, and some opposition Republican leaders are urging non-compliance.
I don't believe that the mandate is the right way to go at this time, particularly the federal mandate that should be struck down, because that's going to give us a greater worker shortage. It's going to increase the resistance for taking the vaccine.
The US Supreme Court will ultimately rule on whether the mandate stands or falls. Business owners traveled to last Friday's hearing in Washington, D.C. to lobby against it.
I am a grocery guy. I'm not the vaccine police. It is not my position. It's not the government's right to put me in the position of the everyday medical decisions of my employees, and they should not be put in a position to have a vaccine or potentially lose their job where they cannot take care of the well-being of their families.
The challenge is being heard as the Omicron variant is overwhelming many US hospitals. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.
Now, in order to support the development and the use and the adoption of battery-powered electric vehicles in the country, China's government has been subsidizing the sector since 2009. But the government has now decided to cut subsidies for these electric vehicle purchases by 30%. They will be phased out completely by the end of the year. So how is that affecting car buyers and the car makers? Ying Jinyi has more.
Under the new policy, a battery electric car priced under 300,000 yuan will see its purchase subsidy cut to between 9,100 and 12,600 yuan this year. That's led several automakers to mark up the prices of their NEVs in anticipation. Tesla has announced increases for its Model 3 and Model Y, and GAC and FAW Volkswagen say they will do the same thing. Some domestic makers are now running special offers to attract customers and show up sales before the prices change. XPeng Motors says it was offering discounts to make up the trimmed subsidies to buyers who settled their payments before yesterday.
The subsidy rollback does not come as a surprise. We offer the discounts to give consumers a grace period, and the prices of most of our popular models will remain quite stable from now on. Actually, the announcement of the subsidy rollback has encouraged more consumers to bring forward their car buying plans.
The automaker says sales of its P7 model have grown substantially over the past 2 months. The cut in subsidies means a lot to some buyers, less to others.
I think it's cost-effective to buy an NEV as early as possible. We still have subsidies now, but later on they'll be gone.
The subsidy rollback does not affect my car buying plans. NEV prices are much lower than before, so it's okay even with lower subsidies.
Another domestic NEV maker, NIO, is also offering a similar deal for buyers who paid a deposit on or before December the 31st and who will take delivery by the end of March. The company also reports a recent uptick in customer numbers.
We began getting more customers before the new year due to the policy adjustment, and our sales have been growing significantly. We don't think further adjustments will impact NEV sales. The NEV share of new vehicle sales was quite high in 2021, and that means NEV sales are now market-driven rather than policy-driven.
Consulting firm Accenture forecasts the subsidy rollback does not mean that NEVs will become less competitive, but will instead promote a more mature industry. Competition between manufacturers will become more about product strength and supply chain improvements.
They should continue to do better in the product itself, in the product concept design, the entire exteriors and interior design, in the manufacturing quality out of the product. The local OEMs need to further think about how they can use digitalization to basically improve the entire value chain, to make sure that not only they have the capability to produce the right product, to sell to their right customers at the right price, but also they are able to manage the entire supply chain at the right cost so that they can become a sustainable company in the next 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 decades to come.
There's something else buyers are beginning to consider, however. Insurance policies exclusively for new energy vehicles are now available in China, and unlike insurance for petroleum-fueled autos, they need to cover batteries, motors, and electronic control system as well. That's a lot, and insurance companies have been upping the cost of their policies to make up for larger potential losses. There's no sign of a market impact yet, but some auto buyers have been complaining about another bump in the road. Yingjun ICS for CGTN, Shanghai.
Now, the world's largest personal electronics show wrapped up in Las Vegas. Attendance was down by over 70% due to the pandemic, but that didn't stop some determined companies from unveiling innovative, practical, and a little unusual tech. Mark News sums up this year's CES experience on what's hot.
Despite fears of CES being a super spreader event, some companies were determined to show they could stop COVID-19 head-on. ViraWarn claims to have both room devices and a breathalyzer device that can detect COVID-19 in the air.
Any coronavirus, any COVID SARS type virus, any influenza virus is a spike protein virus. When it hits a conductive source, it generates an ultra small spark of conductivity. We detect that. The conductivity detected from COVID is different slightly from any other viral matter. We can tell the difference.
Bessemer says their products are backed by research from George Mason University and are currently under FDA review. The merits of some health technology were easier to verify. The Arculus exoskeleton helps surgeons and factory workers stand for extended periods of time. So I'm actually sitting here, pretty comfortable. Why did you feel it's so important to come here?
To be frank, a little bit worried about pandemic, but our product is important to wear in person right here. So it is important to demonstrate here.
So you can really sit on the job, huh? Yeah. Sit down on the job is okay.
Okay.
I could sit here for hours, right? Yeah. Without hardly any strain. Yeah. At the show, virtual reality companies thrilled attendees with some hair-raising experiences. Then there were those experiences that required a second look to fully grasp the transformation right before your eyes. BMW unveiled the iX Flow, which uses electrophoretic technology to change colors, similar to the way e-reader tablets work.
And the use case that we love is also using color to affect sunlight reflectivity. So if it's a hot day outside, sunny, we can switch the car white to reflect the sunlight, and a cold day switch it black to absorb it.
Other auto tech companies use CES for a real-life test. Some of the latest tech is part of the CES experience in the form of the Vegas Loop. If you look over here, here comes my Tesla, ready to transport me from home to home. Elon Musk, the Boring Company, constructed this 2.7-kilometer tunnel that aims to move riders from one end of the convention hall to the other in 2 minutes, a time that is yet to be met. But it's still a unique experience, one the Boring Company has plans to expand to 47 kilometers beneath the city of Las Vegas. In a time of pandemic, some technologies make sense for social distancing, but perhaps even more so for being able to get relaxation on demand. Massage Robotics' two-armed masseuse can be controlled by voice and use both acupressure and sports massage techniques. And what better way to finish off our coverage at CES after our hard work by getting some relaxing massage therapy. Mark New, CGTN, Las Vegas.
All right, then a quick run through commodity prices. Lousy weather is apparently having a bit of a contribution to a reduction in Libya's oil output from its already low levels, around 900,000 or so barrels a day. Oil exports from 2 ports in the western end of the country have been suspended. Ports in the east, though, they're still shut down because of that inclement weather. After a record-breaking run last year, coffee futures are essentially holding steady around the $240 mark. Futures are about 1% higher, 237.20 at 17:15 GMT. Here's what's coming up next. The cafe business in Egypt is taking a hit from a ban on shisha sales. We'll have the details next.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climates and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
I've been Tunis, Cairo, Juba, Johannesburg, Ethiopia, Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Welcome back. Now, a ban in Egypt on smoking water pipes at cafes has hit some SMEs particularly hard. Health authorities there had feared that the popular smoking devices, better known as shisha, could rapidly transmit COVID infections. Now, the ban has since its implementation effectively pushed away many smokers from cafes right across the North African nation. And that in turn has affected the revenues of these small cafes. CGTN's Adele Maruki has the details.
For 2 years now, the Egyptian government has been taking strict health measures to curb the spread of COVID-19 infections. One of the most prominent steps it took is a ban on smoking of water pipes, or as Egyptians like to call them, shisha. Because the pipes are usually shared among strangers and the smoking directly engages the respiratory system, Egyptian health officials feared the popular shisha would be a leading source of infections. As a result, most cafes have been deserted as water pipe smokers kept away.
Cafes have always been a perfect gathering for friends, but since the pandemic began, they have become lifeless. I don't smoke shisha, but most of my friends do. They go to cafes to enjoy the shisha while watching football games. Now both gatherings and shisha are banned. Since then, I don't get to see my friends as much.
Cafes are where we use our leisure time to socialize. We stay in the open air to play some games and meet friends. Public cafes like this one are affordable for all of us. It suits everyone. I don't smoke shisha, but my friends who do tend to vape or quit shisha and they stop going to cafes. Shisha is a headache to prepare and easier to quit than cigarettes, so many people don't come here anymore.
Besides the ban on shisha, the government also restricted the capacity of cafes and other hospitality joints so as to maintain social distancing. That meant they ended up having fewer clients. Authorities also revised business hours, ending for the first time the 24 hours a day operation that was allowed prior to the pandemic. This further worsened the impact that the shisha ban has had on cafe owners.
I understand the risk of shisha as long as there are COVID cases, but we can operate it with limitations. Every client can only use his own device. We can make that work. I would say that 90% of my clients come for shisha. The drinks complement the shisha, not the other way around. After all, how hard is it to make tea or coffee at home?
Our prime profit comes from shisha, not in the drinks. 75% of my income got cut because of the pandemic. I used to hire 3 assistants. Today it's only me. I barely cover my expenses, my running costs and rent.
To ease the financial pressure they now face, cafe owners want the government to impose health measures that will allow them to operate the smoking water pipes while avoiding the possible spread of infections. Some are suggesting that clients purchase their own pipe, which then gets stored and labeled at cafes for their use. Others, however, don't mind sterilizing each device after use. For now, though, the ban remains in place, even as cafe owners struggle to cope with the resultant challenges. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
All right, then a quick update as far as currencies are concerned. Not much of a change in the currencies that we do track here, at least on the fiat side. On the crypto end of the world, though, Bitcoin did slide, as we mentioned a little earlier, under $40,000 on Monday. But the cryptocurrency did later rally. In fact, it's come close to 42,500 in today's trading session. Ethereum also strengthening today, up nearly 2% at 12:45 GMT to 3,130. That's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen on the program in the last hour. Many ways to get your thoughts back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today's up next from Washington, D.C.